All right, let's dive in, folks. So a little bit about the interview process. Just good to know as we get settled in here is that there are many types of interviews. There are different ways interviews can happen and different rounds of interviewing. So types of interviews and what we'll largely focus on today is the behavioral interview because no matter what type of job you're applying for, everyone has to do a behavioral interview, which is really just getting a sense of your story. You'll also, you might encounter case interviews, and that's really for industries like consulting, where you are presented with an issue or a problem known as a case. And the focus of that is really designed to get a sense of how you might solve that problem and what your thinking around that is. And then a technical interview is also another type of interview, and that's really for more of like our like more technical based skilled industries, which is like computer science. So if you were a software engineer, they might give you a particular project where you have to code and they want to get a sense of your coding skills. And that would be called a technical interview. So those are our types. In terms of modalities, so how an interview can happen, might be a phone call, right? Just over your phone, a video chat, so like this, so Zoom, Skype, or a pre-recorded video interview, which means that they just have questions for you and have set up a platform where you just have to record yourself and there's no person on the other end. And then there's the in-person, which is happening far more or less often given the pandemic right now. Okay. In terms of rounds of interviews, this really varies depending on the employer, their hiring process, but generally there's an initial screening. So that's your first round interview. That might be somewhere between 15 minutes to a half hour. You will usually have a second round interview and then a final round interview. So those are sort of like 3 phases, but that in between that second round, you might have multiple rounds where you might talk to the CEO or the director, talk to some teammates that you might have on that in that role. And then you might go to the final round. So just know that there's a range in terms of rounds as well as timing. So it could range between an initial screening, like I said, it could be 15 minutes, or if you go to like a half day interview where you're meeting everyone, or a full day, a super day, right? So just know that timing and rounds depend on the organization. So if you have a particular question about what's it going to look like, you really want to get a sense either from that industry or from that organization. Okay. Also just note that we have some resources on the Career Center's website around case interviews if you want more information about that, since we're going to focus on behavioral interviews today. Okay. So what makes a good interview? This is what we're going to talk about. So some reflection, definitely. Research, definitely some practice. So like I said, the first time that you're telling your story is not in the interview itself. Getting a sense of what type of first impression you want to make. Making sure you're asking your questions, because an interview is just as much you assessing them as it is them assessing you. Following up with them. And just know this, no interviewer goes into an interview saying, I hope we don't find a good fit today. They are rooting for you. They're ultimately looking for someone who is a good fit that aligns. So if we're able to craft our story well in a way that demonstrates alignment and that we're qualified, you're doing a great job. Okay. It might also be useful to take a moment and to consider the identities and experiences you have and hold and carry with you. Which parts of the interviewing process will be easier or more challenging given these identities and experiences? And that's a good thing to reflect on, right, as we get into this. And really reflection and how we tell our story in an interview is, the hope is to really be authentic. And that can be hard, right? Like this interviewer is a stranger and we're trying to share our story. And so this is why also practice is important. But how do we do that? How do we actually tell a relevant story, and an authentic story? So what we hear from employers that's often missing is a coherent narrative, how all of these pieces come together. And so to help you reflect and craft a coherent story, we've got some good questions for you. So one is, what do you want to know about this organization? What's helpful to know about their mission or who they are or what they value? So what's going to help you make an informed decision about that company that goes beyond salary, right? So what do you want to know about their leadership as well? Also, what are 3 things you want to emphasize about yourself and that you want to share with the employer? So that could be pieces of your personality. It could be an experience that you've had that's particularly relevant. I really like this question to frame my entire interview. And that's also going to help frame my answer to the tell me about yourself question, which we'll get to later. So these are good things to think about as you're preparing for an interview. You're ultimately trying to figure out alignment. So you might also want to take a look at that job description, which is where we get into research. So in preparation for a good interview, you want to study the job description. This is like your key to the interview, if the job description has quite a bit of content. So what are the verbs? What are the adjectives? What's the language that's often repeated in that job description? Because that language is what we want to focus on and use to tell our story. That's our key. That's ultimately what they're looking for. So if they keep repeating your research skills, your ability to organize information and synthesize it, that's probably what you're going to want to emphasize in one of the stories that you present to them. You want to spend some time on the company's website just to get a sense of what they do, their history, maybe their About Us page, again, their mission. Some resources to help you with research. So there's definitely some networking. Talking to people can really help get a sense of and go beyond the company's website, right? To get a real sense of what it's like at the organization. So Hoya Gateway, which is basically like LinkedIn, but Georgetown specific, is one way to do that. Then there's LinkedIn, which is another way. You can also look at Vault. Vault is a great resource for getting a sense of industry specific information. And so if we were to go to, let's even just Career Center, and we're going to go to jobs and internships. I'm going to go down to researching, right? And if you scroll down, here's Vault right here. And so that is a resource that has so many, it's like hundreds of PDFs about particular industries and a lot of like wealth of information. So if you just want to get a sense of what is this industry like, Vault's great. Also, you know, it might be useful to do some searching on the company's social media pages. What do they post on LinkedIn? What does it say on Glassdoor, which is like Yelp, but for career? Other social media, Twitter, just to get a sense of anything unique that you might want to bring up in the interview that will demonstrate that you've done research. Okay, so before we jump into practice, don't worry, I'm going to talk a little bit about this particular question. So this is a question that you're going to get in any interview, is some form of tell me about yourself or walk me through your resume, right? And so we want to break this down because frameworks are really good with interview. Structure is really good with conveying a story. And so you might want to start with your personal background and information. Then you might want to go into your academic experience, any professional experience that's relevant, and then you want to bring it back to the position at hand and why you're interested. So let's say, let's see if we can do an example here. So again, remember your 3 things that you want to emphasize, and this is where I might start. Hi, my name's Amanda. In terms of who I am, I'm someone who loves working with people. I pride myself on being a really good active listener and really like to help people feel heard and validated. And I really have a passion for social justice. In terms of where I'm from the DC area. And then you might go into, let's say, like where you went to school. So I went to the University of Tennessee, where I was a volleyball player, and I studied psychology. And from that experience, I really actually got interested in counseling and coaching. So I was a college coach for a little while. And then from that experience, I really wanted to help athletes transition in their career post-sport. which is how I got into counseling and career counseling. And then if I was applying for a specific position, that's where I would bring up other relevant pieces, but also why I'm interested. So you get pieces of my story through that, and you can sort of get a sense of the flow and the transition between. So we don't have a particular position that you're applying for, but what you do want you guys to practice is this question. So take a second to think about how you might frame your answer to this, and then I'm going to pair you up, and then we're going to practice, and then we're going to come back. Okay. So let me stop share real quick. Okay. 1 second. All right, there we go. Join your breakout room, introduce yourself, and then practice this question. And then I'll send you guys a message on when we switch. Go ahead. All right. So I think we've got everyone back with us. Let me just make sure. Okay. So how was that, folks? What was hard? What was fun? Yeah, go for it, Sarah.
I thought like the hardest part for me was just coming up with relevant experiences for a pretend job I was coming up with on the spot. I was just trying to come up with one linear kind of narrative, but that was once I caught my flow, I kind of found some good connections. So that was fun, and also fun to kind of see how someone else can present their experiences, because I was thinking from like my perspective in an interview. I've never interviewed anyone, so it's kind of cool to see.
Yeah, it's nice to be on the other end, right? And to see like how you might, yeah, it gives you good perspective. Yeah, anyone else want to share how that was for them? Was it good to have like some structure around that? Because I would imagine that this question can be pretty hard just to answer if you're like, just tell me about yourself. You're like, cool, what do I say? So structure is always good. Let's talk a little bit about some other types of structures we can use. Oh, sorry. Okay. So you might get this question or some form of it in an interview. Why do you want to work for us? Okay. So to answer this question, you really want to think about how to break it down, because it's asking about 3 questions that you want to answer. Why this particular industry? Why this organization? And why this position? So for me, if it was something like, why counseling, right? I would somehow say something about the holistic nature of the profession. Why this organization? Why Georgetown? As a Jesuit institution, it really does focus on cura personalis and helping others holistically. Why this particular position? My passion for career counseling, and why I love helping people on their own journey, right? And those are the 3 pieces that I would frame together in my answer about why do I want to work for the Colleague Career Education Center. So when you think about this question, break it down. All right. So in any behavioral interview, you're gonna get a question that's like, tell me about a time when you had leadership experience, or give me an example of a time when you were a good listener, or give me an example of a time you had an issue with a coworker and how did you solve it, right? All of those questions are asking for a story, for an experience, for an example. And so a good way to frame and organize your answer is using one of these 2 techniques, and they're very similar: STARS or SORT. So let's talk a little bit about SORT first, the one on the right. So in any story you present, you want to give a little bit of context. So you want to talk a little bit about the situation. Then you might want to talk about the obstacle that you had to overcome in that story, right? What was in your way? What was causing the miscommunication between you and your coworker? How did you get over it? Which is the action next. How did you overcome that? what was the result, and then the takeaway from the story and what you learned and how it's relevant to the position at hand, right? So SOART is one way to frame this. STARS is another way. What's the situation or the task that you had to accomplish? How did you accomplish that task? What was the result of your work? And what are the skills relevant from that experience to this position? So let's say, for example, okay. So let's say in my work at Collie, let's say that there was a time I had to solve a problem creatively. That's the question. How I would answer this is a time when I had to solve a problem creatively was when I was tasked with creating a peer advising program from scratch. That was pretty daunting. It had never been done at the Career Center before. And so how I tackled this is first I did some focus groups. I asked for certain years, so first years, second years, juniors, and seniors to come in. And I really wanted to just understand what was front of mind for them. What would they want from a peer? What would they want to know about them? What would make them feel more comfortable? And that really set the stage for crafting the peer advising program. And now, last year we had 15 peer advisors. This year we're going to have 12 this semester. And it's really exciting that it's growing and it's maintaining. And how that's relevant to this position is that I was able to really do research when tackling this problem. And that really informed how I would create a solution. And I think that that would be relevant for any solution I would have to create at this organization, is I would really want to understand the problem and the people at the organization first. Okay, you see how I did that? First, I'm going to say I restated the question. Then I started with a little bit about the situation, the obstacle, how I did it, which was the meat of my answer. And then I came back with a small takeaway and how it's relevant. Okay. So I'm going to put you guys in breakout rooms again. Don't worry if you kind of have to fumble through this a little bit. It takes a little bit of practice. So think about a skill that you have that's relevant to something that you're interested in. And then think about a time when you had to do it. And then share your answer. Try out one of those two frameworks when providing your answer. And then with your partner, share some feedback, or like what went well, or where you might tweak a little bit. Okay. And then switch and we'll come back again. All right. Here we go. All right, folks, how was that? Who'd like to share a little bit about how that was?
I can share some.
Go for it.
So I think it is important for this question to be prepared for it, because I feel like you can really start talking and talking once you try to set the scene, because you don't know if they really understand and you just keep rambling, and then they're like, you don't want them to tell them 5 minutes about your problem. And then I think you should make sure that it's something that could come up in this company, so that it's like applicable. Yeah, that it's applicable. And yeah, I really like adding like the key takeaway, because I think that's what they're looking for.
Yeah, that's great. I think you're totally right. Like without some structure, it's so easy to ramble, right? And you're like, okay, am I still answering the same question? And so it can be really helpful to have that structure, because it helps you just stay on task and just keep some sense of organization in your head. And then yeah, takeaway, right? Like it can be awkward to end your story or your answer, right? And so the takeaway is a nice way of just bringing it right back. And then you can say, and that's a time when I developed a creative solution, or, and that's a time when I conducted an event successfully. You're basically restating the question again, but doesn't have that sort of like, and yeah, awkward ending, right? So just consider how you might end and start your answer. Great points. Anyone else have any thoughts or just want to talk a little bit about their experience? All right, you guys are doing great. Okay, here we go. So some other questions that you guys are gonna get asked in an interview. Well, a common one is, what are your strengths and weaknesses? And so with this, we actually want to prepare for our answers with these questions differently. So for strengths, well, for both of these, you just in case want to prepare an example of 3 in case they ask, you know, what are 3 weaknesses you have, or what are 3 strengths you have? So prepare for 3 just in case they ask you for that. With strengths, they're really looking for examples. They don't want you to just say like, oh, public speaking is my strength, but they want you to say how and in what way public speaking and what experience you have with this to give evidence, right? And that's really how you come across confident in an interview, is to give evidence. And particularly with strengths, you want to come off confident in those strengths. And so make sure you prepare examples. If you're like, oh, what are my strengths? Consider folks that know you well and say, you know, ask them, what do you think my strengths are? And that can give you a sense. Or even just thinking for yourself, like, what would my friends say that I do well? That could help jog your memory. And when answering this question, I'll give you a little bit of a framework. I like to state my strengths first and then go in order of example. So for instance, I might say, great question. In terms of my strengths, I would say public speaking, listening, and working on a team are my strengths in terms of public speaking. And then I would go into that example. And that again gives me nice organization for how I go through my answer. Now with weaknesses, okay, we really want to keep in mind what they're asking. When an employer asks you, what are your weaknesses? The point is to assess whether or not you can actually self-reflect on where you need to grow and then can go out and actually work on that area of growth. So to answer this question, you want to actually focus on what we call the 20-80 rule. 20% of your answer should be how that thing is a weakness, and then 80% of your answer should be what you've done to improve upon it. So let's actually take public speaking, because this used to be a weakness of mine. So I would say, you know, public speaking has been a weakness of mine for many years, particularly when I was a freshman coming into college. And so what I did to really improve upon it was I did a lot of practice with peers. I used this tool called Big Interview to practice many types of interviews and just record and watch myself and review those recordings and see what I could do better each time. And then with class projects, I would really try to get feedback from my peers in those class projects on what I did well as from my professors. See, from that answer, you can get a sense of like, yes, that was a weakness, but far more of my answer was how I actively worked on that weakness. And that's a really good thing to come across with an employer. Any question about either of these questions? Okay, we'll keep going. Okay, so what if in the interview you either don't know the answer or don't understand what they're asking? Here are some strategies, right? So first, let's say interviewing in general can be pretty stressful. So whenever you get sort of tripped up, it's really best to have a few key things. I always keep water right next to me, right? And so if I don't know an answer, I'm like, that's a really great question. And I take a breath. So do you mind if I take a second to think about it, right? Or I could ask the employer, you know, could you tell me a little bit more about what you mean by this term? I'm not exactly familiar with it, or I kind of think that this is what you're asking, but I just want to make sure, right? And again, that comes across as confident because you're asking them for more information and you're being thoughtful about your answer. What if you need more time to think or the question is complex? right? Again, you can pause. This is where I like, that's a great question. Do you mind if I take a second to think about it, right? So it's okay to pause. Another trick is to restate the question. A time when I had to solve a problem creatively. Even just saying that, I've now taken some time to think, and my memory might be jogged a little bit. So it's far more better to have a thoughtful answer and to pause than it is to just have a fast response, because then we get into the trap of likely rambling. So consider what strategies might be useful for you and what you want to practice. Hang on one second. So another question that we just want to name that you might get is, you might get asked, what have you done during the pandemic? And that's an interesting question, because a lot of opportunities haven't necessarily been available. And so think about what they're really asking with this question. And likely it's like, how creative did you get during the pandemic in order to gain experience or pass your time or stay organized? And so just think about very flexibly what you've done and what counts as experience, right? Maybe it's you did a LinkedIn Learning class and spent like 3 hours on LinkedIn Learning to learn a new skill, right? Maybe you took care of a sibling, and that's been the main focus of what you've been doing, and you know, you really cherish that time with family. So in general, just consider 1 or 2 things that you've learned, but you don't have to come across by saying like, oh, I did all these things, because that's so hard right now. So I just want to name that you're likely going to get some form of that question. And I would also say, like, it's helpful to say like just how you stayed organized, knowing that in a remote setting, remote work, employers want to get a sense of, you know, how adjusted are you to remote work, which all Georgetown students are in some way, shape, or form, because we've had to adjust to virtual learning. So you guys are well practiced. Okay. So when we consider first impressions, what's really important to think about is like, when have you felt confident in giving a first impression? And that's a really good thing to reflect on, because that's what you want to replicate in an interview, is that feeling of confidence. And so think for yourself, you know, maybe how you dressed, what did you say, how did you prepare? And then if you guys have any questions about professional dress or first impressions at all, throw them in the chat. We put some common interview pitfalls in here, and I would say, like, let's get critical about this, because giving first impressions can be contextualized within the culture that we're in, and so it can be important to just have a critical eye. So just in general, not researching a company or an industry can be a pitfall. So just do a little bit of research there, so that way you can come across as researched. It can be hard right now if you don't have an iron. So if you don't iron, that's okay. You just might want to reconsider what you wear, so you can't exactly think of, you can't exactly see how crinkly. So for instance, this is a sweater and it doesn't exactly wrinkle. So pretty easy to wear. So you might just want to consider what comes across easy in the video. Now, because we're virtual, you also want to consider the background that you have. I've got a virtual background, but let's say you want something that doesn't have a glare or a white background. So that's just something to consider when we're giving virtual interviews now. In person, something that has been noted by employers is too much cologne or perfume. If you have questions about that, it's not like we're in person right now, but it could be something that you could ask a peer or someone that you trust, to just get a sense of like, is this amount okay? Smiling. Again, this is a nervous space. Interviewing can be hard. And so taking breaths, taking sips of water can really help you calm down, and also calm your pace of how much you talk. When we get nervous, we talk really, really fast, and sometimes we don't know. And so your pace is important, and just trying to be as authentic and comfortable as you can, knowing that this can be a pretty uncomfortable space to be in. So I want to recognize that. Something that career culture also says is handshakes are important. I would say right now we're not doing any handshakes, so all good there. But if you ever have questions about this, and we go back to in person, come onto the Career Center. We can certainly help you practice, but that's also just a cultural thing, right? Like depending on the culture, handshakes might not be okay. So again, good to be critical here. And if you guys have questions, just ask, because it's a bit nuanced. And if you guys have questions about the virtual setup, we've had folks come into drop-ins and just say like, hey, how does this look in my background? Like, is everything okay? So you can always just get an opinion from us and test that out before you go in an interview. All right. So another good part of a good interview is asking your questions to the employer. So this is your time to assess them. All right. So what's really important for you to understand from them? You might want to ask something that shows that you've done your research about the organization. For instance, I might say, I saw recently on LinkedIn that you're moving to work towards this project or this goal. Could you tell me a little bit more about how this department is connected with that project? Right now, in just that small little piece, I've shown that I've done a little bit of research. So start with what you know, ask the question. You can ask about the job itself, going beyond the job description. What's something that would surprise a candidate about the day-to-day in this role? Or what challenges can I anticipate? Or let's say I get this role. What would you hope that I accomplish in the first 30 to 60 days? Right? Goes beyond the job description and really can get a sense of what you want to focus on or highlight about your own experience. Ask questions related to what you value, right? And how you want to assess those values with the employer. So it could be, how has your organization worked to create more inclusive workspaces? How and in what ways, right? We really want to get examples from them. Just as much as they want examples from us, I want examples from the employer of what they've done. So versus saying something like, do you collaborate, right? What does collaboration look like on your team is a far better question, right? So asking open-ended questions. Towards the end of your interview, you want to make sure to ask about next steps. Yeah, one last question for you. When can I expect to hear back, or what do the next steps look like in that hiring process? And that sort of starts to end the interview. Ultimately, your questions should not ask about salary, vacation, or perks, because that really comes into play in the final round once you get an offer, and that's when you can negotiate. If you have questions about negotiation right now, you can always go to the Career Center website, because we've got a whole page on salary negotiation. Okay, any questions here, y'all? Okay, we'll keep going. After the interview, so what I always like to do is take notes. What did I talk about? If we got conversational, like, oh, I noticed you went to Ohio State. My dad's a big Ohio State fan. OHIO. I might say something about Ohio State in my note to them. So that way it jogs their memory of who I am and creates more rapport with that interviewer. In terms of what type of note, there's no real difference between whether or not you send a handwritten note or an email, as long as you follow up. I will say this, if you're gonna send a handwritten note, just make sure you send a quick email note and note that you have a handwritten note coming. So that way they know that they can expect that. And it's just always good to say thank you for your time. So make sure you follow up right away, whether that's day of or the next day. You don't generally want to wait a week after to follow up. Let's say you don't hear back for a little bit. Let's say you don't hear back for a week after the interview. Generally, what we say is rule of thumb is you can reach back out to them after about 2 weeks and just say like, thank you so much again for your time. I'm curious when we should hear back about next steps or where you guys are at in your hiring process. That is totally okay. If you try earlier in that, it can be a little too soon. So 2 weeks is our rule of thumb. Okay. All right. Are you guys still feeling like this? I hope not. I hope we've cleared some of the air for you guys in terms of interviewing. You guys have gotten some practice. Really appreciate you guys diving in there and practicing and meeting with another Georgetown peer. So hopefully you're feeling a little bit better. Some resources. So let me actually share Big Interview with you real quick. Hold on. So this is what Big Interview looks like. It's a resource that you have that can actually help you practice with your interviews. It's basically like those pre-recorded video interviews that I was talking about at the very, very beginning. So this is what it looks like. If I go to practice, we could do a general interview, we can do an industry related interview, or practice for a government. Let's say I'm interested in like a particular industry. And I'm interested in, let's say, management consulting. So we've got a basic interview, a case style interview if you want to practice that, practice answering people skill questions, being a team player. Let's go for the basic for right now. All right, hang on one second. I want to continue. Okay, so you can actually see me here, and then when I'm ready, this is the interviewer. I go ahead and hit play. I give my answer. It records. I stop. I can watch myself and say, okay, what did I like about that? So this is a great resource for practicing. All right. Let's go back. Okay. So we also have an interview guide and interview guide on our website that I highly recommend you guys take a look at. Has a lot of really good details and examples of questions that you could ask as well. We have mock interviews. So if you want to just get some practice and do like a full practice of a behavioral interview, sign up for a mock interview, and you can do so through Handshake under the Appointments tab. Come into drop-ins. Just say like, meet with one of our wayfinders. There are peer advisors that I was mentioning about in one of my earlier answers, and ask them, I'd love to practice my tell me about yourself question, or what do you think of these questions I have for the employer, right? They can give you some good ideas. So come on to drop-ins. Alumni and Career Services actually has some really good webinars on YouTube about interviews as well. So feel free to take a look at that. On Handshake, you might see that some employers will actually have interview preparation workshops. So if you're interested in a particular employer, take a look at Handshake to see if they have an interview prep workshop and go to that, because that's going to be very particular to that organization, which is great information. There's also Hoya Gateway. So let's take a look. This is what it looks like. So Hoya Gateway is great for connecting with folks. And I'll say this, folks who are on here, some of them have actually signed up to say like, hey, I'll do a mock interview with you. I'll help you practice your interviews. So a way that you can find that is just go to Browse Network, and then you can actually see, and when you look at someone's profile, they'll say what they can help you with: resumes, cover letters, informational interviewing, or mock interview practice. Okay. That is us for today, y'all. So I'll stick around if you guys have any more questions, but just want to say thank you so much for being here. I hope this was informative. If you have any questions at all, come to drop-ins. You can shoot me an email. I'll put my NAT ID in the chat here. And be sure to take a look at our website. We've got, like I said, a lot of great content there.